You Don't Bring Me Flowers by Kathryn Cappell, MD, PhD. Easter morning dawned a beautiful spring day in Washington, D.C. Soft sunlight and a cool breeze streamed through my bedroom window. My children woke up early, and I listened to their shouts of delight as they found their baskets, brimming with grass and chocolate eggs wrapped in pink and purple foil. Later that morning, I drove to a local hospital where I was rounding. Cherry blossom trees bursting with pink flowers bloomed throughout our peaceful neighborhood, and their showers of pollen had coated my car windows in a soft dusting of green. I put my arm out of the car window and caught the heavy scent of flowers as fresh air flooded in. The fifth patient of my rounds, Evelyn, had been in the hospital for 22 days. This morning, as the charge nurse, Frances, and I entered the room, I noticed a vase brimming full of bright pink flowers beside her bed. Evelyn caught my eye and looked guiltily at her lovely bouquet. "I know, it's against the rules," she said, "but my son brought them, and they make me so happy." Fresh flowers were indeed against ward policy. Theoretically, flowers could introduce fungal spores that could float through the air and lodge into the vulnerable lungs of our neutropenic patients. Evelyn was not the only patient who had received flowers. On that Easter day, the elevator area outside the oncology ward bloomed with forbidden flowers mistakenly brought by other loving sons. Frances kindly offered to take a picture of the flowers for Evelyn and print it out. Frances explained that this way she could still enjoy the picture while protecting herself and other patients on our ward. I found myself unsure. I wanted Evelyn to have the joy of the flowers during her long hospitalization. I could picture her son, a lumbering man in his 60s, carefully selecting the flowers last night. He was a quiet man, and I got the impression that bringing flowers was a way for him to share his feelings about his mother. Evelyn had been separated from her family for almost a month and was isolated in a hospital room without the ability to even open a window to enjoy a fresh breeze. She had maintained her gentle and positive attitude throughout, bravely battling complications from chemotherapy. The flowers probably brought her a little chance to savor the beauty of spring and reflect on the love from her son. I did not want to take that from her. Still, I knew the importance of ward policies and protecting our vulnerable patients. I dislike taking things from my patients, but I have been diligently doing so for most of my career. As a medical student and resident, I remember oncology patients struggling to tolerate a neutropenic diet devoid of many fresh fruits and vegetables. A generation of doctors advised patients that the neutropenic diet was necessary to protect them from infections. I recall one young boy with leukemia repeatedly asking for fresh blueberries, and the medical team insisting he follow the neutropenic diet. He eventually got sicker and died. I am not sure if he ever got a blueberry. I think of him with a lingering tension that we did him wrong by taking away something that could have brought him joy before he died. This is particularly true because the neutropenic diet has now been largely debunked. The modern oncology patient enjoys the blueberries that only 20 years ago we would have assiduously removed from the room. Like the neutropenic diet, there is little evidence that fresh flowers pose a significant infection risk. Fungal spores could theoretically also come into the ward on fresh fruits and the dust tracked in on employee shoes, yet we ban neither of these. The CDC hospital infection control recommendations note that there are minimal evidence-based studies in this area, but cautiously recommend against flowers in areas where immunosuppressed patients are located. The lack of evidence is reflected in varying hospital policies regarding flowers. Some major medical centers ban flowers on the oncology ward, and others do not. I stood before Evelyn with her pink flowers as she implored me to overhaul the policy and allow her to keep them. Bright sunlight shone in through her window, and the room felt stuffy and closed, in stark contrast to the lovely outdoor scene. The flowers did add a hint of beauty to an otherwise sterile-appearing room. The vase that held these was clean, and the water crystal clear. If we tested the flowers and water, would it be brimming with fungus that would subsequently endanger Evelyn and others on the ward? Who knew? In the absence of evidence, I followed the rules. Evelyn's face fell as I concurred with Frances that it was ward policy to not allow flowers in the room. She was too polite to argue, and though she looked disappointed, her demeanor toward Frances and me did not change. Frances took a picture of the flowers and brought the picture back to Evelyn. The flowers were carefully moved to the oncology elevator lobby. I finished my rounds, put in orders, wrote my notes, and went home to my children. The afternoon was as lovely as when I went into work that morning. My kids rushed at me as I got out of the car, eager for a promised afternoon Easter egg hunt. My son climbed on the apricot tree in front of our house, and little flower petals fell to the ground as the branches shook from his weight. He was still at an age where he would often pick dandelions in the yard and tuck these carefully behind my ear. It is his simple way of expressing love, and it makes me feel cherished. I pictured him, a grown man, bringing flowers to me in the hospital someday, and how painful it might be to have those taken away. I could not quite shake the feeling I had made the wrong decision. I mentally reassured myself that it was hospital policy to take away Evelyn's flowers. And after all, it was for her own protection, was it not?
Hello, and welcome to JCO's Cancer Stories, The Art of Oncology, which features essays and personal reflections from authors exploring their experience in the oncology field. I'm your host, Mikkael Sekeres. I'm Professor of Medicine and Chief of the Division of Hematology at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, University of Miami. Today, we're joined by Dr. Kathryn Cappell, Assistant Research Physician at the National Cancer Institute. In this episode, we will be discussing her Art of Oncology article, You Don't Bring Me Flowers. At the time of this recording, our guest has no disclosures. Katie, welcome to our podcast, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's such a delight to have you here. Can you just start by giving us a little bit of your background?
I've been practicing mainly in hematologic malignancies. And at the time of the writing of this article, I was an assistant research physician at the National Cancer Institute. Before that, I trained at University of Miami, actually where you work, for my bachelor's. Then I went to University of North Carolina for an MD PhD. And then I was at Stanford for my residency, followed by NCI for my fellowship.
That's great. I didn't know about your University of Miami connection. I feel like I have to throw up a U to you on our video recording here.
Yes, your screen looks very recognizable from my undergrad.
Well, it's great to be reunited then with you. I was wondering if I could ask you to talk a little bit about your writing process. When did you start writing, and when do you find the time to write?
Yeah, so this is actually my first story that I've written in a long time, probably in 20 years.
Wow.
I started writing this story because when I was rounding at this hospital, I always noticed the flowers being absent in rooms. And I liked to chart my notes at the nurses' station where a lot of patients would come and check in. And when they were checking in, I'd often hear people getting their flowers taken away and moved to the lobby. So I've been thinking about the piece for a long time, just from rounding and while I was listening to all these conversations about patients losing their flowers. So that's where it came from. And it's my first piece.
That's really amazing. It's a phenomenon we witness all the time when people with all of the best intentions bring things into patients who are in the hospital for 3 or 4 weeks, like those patients who are getting treatment for acute leukemia or those who are undergoing a transplant, to try to make their room more recognizable and more home-like for them. And then we often see those things whisked away because of hospital policies.
Yeah, definitely.
When you're writing, does an essay all come out at once, or do you revisit it? So how do you refine your writing to transform it into a work of art?
This piece I started writing probably actually a year ago. It took me a long time to get started, to the point where I was thinking about it for a long time, thinking about the piece for almost a year. I can remember that because I started thinking about it at ASH 2023, and I hadn't really finished it till ASH 2024. And during that time, a lot was going on in my head about how I would structure the piece. And then once I had started writing it, I went through multiple revisions before I got the courage to submit one to JCO.
I love how you frame it in terms of the courage to submit to JCO. I just read a post from Adam Grant, who's an economist and writes about kind of our actions in the workplace. And he mentioned the point that we often will put something off out of fear, right? It's not some kind of deliberate action on our part to avoid doing something that we don't want to do. It's really fear of failure and fear of anxiety that prevents us from doing something. So you talk about courage. I think the flip side of courage is fear. Describe what that's like, that first moment that you decide, okay, I'm going to write a piece and I want to write something that's public that other people will see.
Yeah, I think most people, when they write, it's a very personal thing to share something that you've written, especially if you've been thinking about it in your mind for quite a long time. That's actually part of the reason I don't write very often, is because of that. And I think you're right that it comes from fear of sharing it. So I started out by, I was just going to write this for myself. And then as I got more comfortable with it over time, I decided, well, I might as well share this piece to see what happens.
Did you bounce the idea off of friends or colleagues to kind of see what their reaction would be before you kept taking those steps that eventually led to a completed piece and submitting it to JCO?
Yes, I did bounce it off a friend who had the same experience in the same hospital with flowers getting taken away from patients. So I checked to see if other people had had the kind of same reaction to it as I had.
That's great. It's always helpful to have a cadre of supportive readers when you first start writing, people who are going to, talk about what's great about your piece and then give you advice that you can trust that's more helpful in revising it.
Yes.
I love how in this piece you explore the tension we face as hematologist oncologists between recommending what we feel is medically appropriate for our patients and feeling as if we've taken away some of their agency and some of their liberty. Can you discuss this in a little more detail?
You'd think that the hardest thing about being a hematologist oncologist would be knowing all the drugs and knowing what you should do. But I think that that's actually one of the easier parts. The harder parts is these kind of interactions that arise, because I think they have an emotional component to them, and that makes it harder to do day on and day out, dealing with those things. I mean, I think hospital policies are important and they're there to protect people. So I think, in the end of the story, I did do what the hospital policy said to do. And I think that that's in some ways important to make sure we have a good environment for everybody on the ward. But I think it's really painful as a doctor to have to make those decisions where it impacts someone's agency and someone's joy and what they're getting out of a day-to-day life, especially when they're in the hospital for a really long time.
Was there something that you could do to make up for it? So sometimes we'll take something away like beautiful flowers for fear of introducing infection in a ward where people are immunocompromised, but we can make up for it by saying, okay, but we're okay with you bringing food in from the outside.
Yeah, so the nurse in the story, I mean, she definitely was trying to make up for it. She was a very sweet nurse with helping me. She went and printed out the picture of the flowers, which I think is one thing you can do. But another thing I'm seeing a lot of patients do and family members do is bring in paper flowers. They decorate the room in other ways, which I think makes it meaningful and still nice for people. And I think the nurses on our ward did a great job doing that too. They decorate the rooms and try to still keep a very nice environment.
That's terrific. What other things do family members do to try to make the room more of a home environment?
Bringing in their own blankets for people, so they have their own comforter on the bed is a big one. Bringing in pictures of family members, putting them on the walls, on the windows. Bringing in food from home, I think, is very important.
I completely agree. And there was a recent study looking at neutropenic precautions in a transplant unit and whether or not those actually improved the outcome of patients. And it turns out it didn't. So we've had these incredibly restrictive diets for patients that I think we can feel much more comfortable now relaxing and allowing people their comfort foods, which you as a University of Miami graduate know here involves a lot of Cuban food.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that that neutropenic diet is a great parallel to that. We start instituting things that kind of take away people's agency and something that brings them joy, but we might not have that great of evidence for it. And it really does impact people's happiness, I think, in a lot of ways and comfort in the hospital.
Yeah, and that's so important for getting through this ordeal of being in the hospital sometimes for weeks. You start and end the essay writing about your family. And this beautifully illustrates the freedom that they and you have compared to your patients who are confined to the hospital on a lovely holiday weekend. How do you navigate what must feel almost like survivor's guilt of being free from the hospital when others aren't and being able to shift your focus to the joy of being around your children enjoying their holiday?
Yeah, I think children help you focus it themselves. When I come home, they're pretty focused on what they want. They want their Easter egg hunt. In the morning, they need their Easter baskets. So that alone brings you back into a different world. I come back and suddenly I'm thinking about where the Easter eggs are going to go. That helps me a lot doing that. But I also think most people in oncology, most physicians it is a difficult separation. You do think about your patients outside of work hours. That is something that's hard to do. But I'd say my children actually help me with that, getting my mind onto something different because they're just so active and they have so much going all the time.
It's interesting how you frame that also, how your children help you. I remember distinctly one time my daughter asked me, how was work? And I said, oh, it was a hard day because I had to tell somebody some bad news. And she very deliberately said to me, you need to separate what you tell us at home from what happens at work. We don't want to hear your sad stories.
Oh, that's a sad story in itself.
Well, it is, right? But it was kind of very helpful to me to realize that, yes, we have to compartmentalize not only for our own health, but also for the health of our family. We've chosen this path in our lives, which is this incredible opportunity to be around people who have a cancer diagnosis at a pivotal point in their lives, but our family hasn't necessarily made that same choice.
The children don't understand it 100%.
Do you feel as if hematologist oncologists are better at compartmentalizing maybe than other professionals in medicine?
I'm not sure. I feel like a lot of medicine has those sad points that are difficult. So I think psychiatry is a good example of that. That's hard to, I think, very difficult to compartmentalize. So I'm not sure. I think other physicians also have difficulties with it. But I do think we see a lot of difficult scenarios more than other groups. So that could make it that we're better at compartmentalizing.
You mention in your essay, you refer to your patient's lumbering son. I love that phrase, the lumbering son who brings her the flowers. Do you think it helps to see that backstory to what's going on in your patients' lives? There's a risk of almost too much empathy, of knowing too much about it, and therefore having an even more difficult time separating yourself.
For me, I think it helps with patient care a lot to know their family. So you know where they're going back when they leave the hospital. You kind of know what helps you know what they value. So I think in a lot of ways, it does help for patient care to know what they're coming from in terms of family members. I do think sometimes getting too involved and knowing too much about the situation and attaching to it emotionally can make it hard to be objective. So I think that it's important to keep some distance there in terms of being able to make good decisions for your patients as well.
You mention looking at people's rooms and seeing the photos up on the wall. I always think we worry about the patients most who don't have any photos up on the wall and what kind of support system they're going back to when they're discharged from the hospital.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's definitely something I think about as well.
You end this beautiful essay by asking the question, and I'm quoting you now, I couldn't quite shake the feeling I'd made the wrong decision. I mentally reassured myself that it was hospital policy to take away Evelyn's flowers, and after all, it was for her own protection, wasn't it? And I'm wondering, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Katie. Can you answer your own question?
Boy, I'm not sure if I can still. I think that's part of where the tension in the piece arises from. I think when you're in a hospital, you're working as a team. And part of the thing I think about is nurses are an important part of that team and they structure the ward. So I don't think it's just my decision. I think it's a hospital decision as a team. And I do think there's a component of fairness. If you're going to say it to one patient, that's the policy. It should be the patient policy to all patients. So in some ways, I reassure myself about that. But in the other side of me, it still makes me a little sad.
Yeah, it's well stated. I'm wondering that the hospital in which you work changed their policy, or did your previous position change their policy?
I haven't actually mentioned this story to them yet or asked them to change their policy. I do feel it's pretty common at the different hospitals I've worked at seeing a policy similar to this. So I haven't asked.
Well, Katie, I want to thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Your writing is elegant. The tale that you tell resonates with all of us, and it's been just delightful getting to know you even better.
Great to meet you as well. Thank you for having me on.
Until next time, thank you for listening to JCO's Cancer Stories, The Art of Oncology. Don't forget to give us a rating or review, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find all of ASCO shows at asco.org/podcasts. Thank you again.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.